Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Nyman. I'm a senior principal at Geosyntech Consultants in California and facilitating today's event. The webinar today focuses on DoD-funded research efforts to enhance wildland fire management tools for military land use and training. First, Dr. Andy Hudak from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service will discuss his work on the development of improved surface and canopy fuel maps using LiDAR to provide more realistic inputs to fire behavior models. Second, Dr. Sarah Brambilla from Los Alamos National Laboratory will talk about her research to demonstrate and validate a new tool to model smoke dispersal downwind of a fire. Each of these two presentations will be followed by a brief question and answer session, and then depending on time, we will conclude the webinar with a Q&A session with both of our speakers. The next couple of slides provide some instructions for the webinar today. If you haven't done so, download Zoom at the link shown here and provided to you in your webinar registration email. If you cannot download Zoom, you can view the slides using a compatible internet browser like Firefox or Edge, and by creating a free Zoom account. And if you still can't view the slides, or if your screen freezes, you can try keying Control with F5 to perform a hard refresh. In case of continued technical difficulties, you can always download a PDF of the slides from the webinar webpage and then call into the conference line provided to you in your webinar registration email. We will also be live streaming the webinar on the SERDP and ESTCP YouTube channel at the link shown here. Today's broadcast is listen only. You may submit questions by using the Q&A box on your screen, and you don't need to wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions. We would love for you to submit questions in advance of that session. When submitting your questions, please add the name of your organization at the end of your question. Please don't submit questions in the chat box. The chat box is reserved for comments related to technical difficulties. And with that, I would like to introduce Kevin Hires, who serves as the SERDP and ESTCP Program Manager for Resource Conservation and Resilience and the Climate Resilience Program area. In this capacity, Kevin is responsible for identifying strategic research needs to support conservation, climate adaptation, environmental security, ecosystem management, and wildland fire management on DoD installations. Kevin brings nearly 30 years of experience at the interface of natural resource management and science. His academic and management work have focused on fire ecology, conservation of threatened and endangered species, and the science support of prescribed fire modeling to meet ecosystem management objectives. Kevin received his master's degree in conservation ecology from the University of Georgia. Kevin, please proceed.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's SERDP and ESTCP webinar. The next few slides will provide a quick overview of both SERDP and ESTCP, which are the Department of Defense's installations innovation programs. The programs fund resilience, restoration, and conservation projects that enhance capabilities and sustain operations at DoD installations. SERDP invests in basic and applied research that sustain and advance operations at DoD installations. SERDP supports industry, federal agencies, and universities in early-stage research and development activities. SERDP is managed alongside its partner program, the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, or ESTCP, which demonstrates and validates innovative environmental and installation energy technologies. ESTCP projects collect unbiased cost and performance data to supply defense managers and end users with information they need to implement approved technologies and facilitate DoD adoption at scale. SERDP and ESTCP are housed under the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installations and Environment, which means that we work hand in hand with our implementation partners for installation energy, restoration, conservation, and resilience efforts. Our projects align with national security priorities and provide the data and capabilities that DoD leadership need to shape guidance and instructions aimed at securing our military installations. This collaboration ensures policy decisions encourage and facilitate the adoption of scientific approaches, methodologies, and technologies that advance the DoD mission. With more than 320 military bases that span a diverse range of geographic regions in the United States, the challenges that installation face are varied. For this reason, our portfolio matches the breadth and scope of these issues. Our science and technologies protect built and natural infrastructure, strengthen DoD chemical and material resilience, and ensure the health and safety of our warfighters. Innovation investments also drive significant time and cost savings, enabling redeployment of capital to other critical mission needs. Our research portfolios are organized across 6 program areas. The Environmental Restoration Program area focuses on managing PFAS and other emerging chemicals of concern in the environment. Our Resource Conservation and Resilience Program area focuses on sustaining the 27 million acres of installation natural infrastructure for test and training ranges, as well as critical nearshore environments or environmental security threats to the military mission globally. The Weapons Systems and Platform Program area focuses on reducing the environmental impact and improving the chemical and material resilience of weapon systems and platforms, operations, and maintenance. The Installation Energy and Water Program area demonstrates and validates technologies that enhance resilience against disruptions to public energy and water infrastructure. The Natural Hazards Adaptation Program area demonstrates innovative and cost-effective technologies and methodologies to ensure DoD installations can plan for, withstand, and recover from events such as earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, storms, and wildfire. Finally, the Munition Response Program area focuses on unexploded ordnance in the underwater environment, including ponds, lakes, rivers, estuaries, and coastal ocean areas. After years of successful investment, this program area is currently transitioning technologies to end users through a series of test sites and live site demonstrations. SERDP and ESTCP are a critical funding source and partner for hundreds of federal, university, and industry R&D efforts. Our investments link our defense and industrial bases to the broader economic and innovation ecosystem in the United States. We release several solicitations throughout the year, and researchers from federal government, private industry, and research institutions can apply to SERDP and ESTCP funding opportunities. To receive updates about funding opportunities, program updates, and upcoming webinars, you can sign up for our mailing list at the link on this slide. Our webinar series highlights outstanding projects across all our research portfolios. You can find additional information about upcoming webinars at this link. All past webinars are archived and can be accessed using this link. I would like to remind you that a copy of today's presentation can be downloaded from our webinar webpage. We would appreciate it if you could please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Jennifer to introduce today's first speaker. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our first speaker today is Dr. Andy Hudak, who has worked for the United States Forest Service since 1999, first with the Pacific Northwest Research Station and then with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Andy currently studies biophysical relationships between field and remotely sensed data, including estimating above ground biomass carbon across the Western US from airborne LiDAR, Landsat time series, and other environmental data. His work also focuses on predicting fuel and carbon loads from 3D point cloud metrics at multiple scales and relating fuel consumption to energy flux and fire effects. Andy received his bachelor's degree in ecology, evolution, and behavior from the University of Minnesota and his doctoral degree in biology from the University of Colorado. Andy, please go ahead and get us started.
Thank you for that introduction, and I really appreciate the invitation to present here in this webinar today. I'll be presenting on the SERDP project I've been leading since 2020 on object-based aggregation of fuels, and we want to do that so that we can get better estimates as well of the heat flux and emissions, and we're focusing on frequently burned DoD installations. Before I proceed, I want to acknowledge in particular postdoc Nuria Sanchez, who is the primary architect and was of this work I'm going to present today. So as an outline, I'm going to be focusing on the tree crown objects, as is in the title of our project. trees are the dominant features in forest, and we can characterize trees very well with remote sensing. So that makes them very amenable to mapping, particularly with LiDAR. LiDAR is an active remote sensing technology that collects 3D point clouds. And so we can get very accurate estimates of the crown foliage and other fuels in the tree crowns that contribute to fire behavior. Those materials in the tree crowns are the primary inputs into the surface fuel bed. And it's the litter, the downwinded debris, and the duff that accumulates in the surface that is the primary fuel for surface fires. And the DoD installations where we work are very much governed by surface fire regimes. So why do we focus on the trees to get surface fuel loads? Well, it's because of this relationship of the overstory to and then deposition of that material to the surface fuel bed. So we're taking this approach where we use LiDAR to characterize the overstory, which we can do well, to then get better estimates of the surface fuel bed, which is a harder thing to do with remote sensing. Later, I'll talk then at the conclusions from this approach and then how this benefits the DoD installations of our partners. So limitations of current techniques. First of all, fuels are just very heterogeneous on the forest floor. They're difficult to measure even on the ground. And so there are large uncertainties associated with any estimates of fuels. Remote sensing is advantageous for getting maps. So if only we could get better maps of the surface fuel bed at scale, that would be exactly what managers need to plan the surface fire regimes. The problem is remote sensing has low sensitivity to the surface fuel bed. Whether it's an active sensor like LiDAR or radar, or a passive sensor like multispectral satellite imagery or airborne imagery. As the signal encounters the top of the canopy, it occludes the material and the background beneath it. And so you have more sensitivity to the overstory and then diminishing sensitivity to the midstory and the understory, and the least sensitivity of all to the surface. So those fuel loads which dominate near the surface or within 10 centimeters, that's a difficult thing to get an estimate for with remote sensing by any technology. So just to talk about what is a fuel bed, fuel beds are themselves complex in forest. They're comprised of some mixture of shrubs and herbs, which are only loosely coupled to where the trees are, and then also downwinded debris, litter, and duff. And those materials are more tightly coupled to the overstory because it's the trees that are the primary contributors to the downwinded debris, litter, and duff. So just to define what these materials are, the litter refers to the non-woody material that comes from the tree. Downwinded debris is the woody material, which customarily gets broken into these size fractions, 1 hour, 10 hour, and 100-hour fuels that we lump together to call fine woody debris, and then the 1,000-hour fuels, which comprises the coarse woody debris. And then all this material decomposes into duff, which is also called ground fuel. So we have field data, and that's what we use to calibrate and validate our models. So we collected them across this range of sites in the southeastern US. These are not all DoD installations, but they all are southern pine ecosystems that are maintained with frequent fire. And they're mostly dominated by longleaf pine. To get surface fuel estimates, we're using remote sensing, but we also have to tie in ecological processes. And the processes involved with this approach are litter production from the overstory. That's what we're using the LiDAR for. Then we have to model the deposition that causes litter accumulation in the surface fuel bed. In the absence of fire, that litter decomposes into duff. So we have to account for that process. And then there's combustion from the fires, which is removing some proportion of the material on the ground. So again, surface fuel beds are highly heterogeneous. In other words, they're unevenly distributed over the forest floor, but because the material largely comes from the overstory, the pattern of surface fuel beds should resemble that of the tree distributions. We are assuming in our approach that an equilibrium is attained between surface fuel production and then decomposition with time since the last fire. And the primary drivers of these processes of accumulation in the southeastern forests are time since fire, or the fire return interval, and then the amount of biomass overhead that contributes to the surface fuel accumulation. So here's some data. This data in the plot on the right was collected by the 3D Fuels project, which was just recently completed last year. And this was also a SERDP-funded project that visited many of the same sites that the Objects project is working on. And you can see the different pools of fuels in this graph. Again, they're highly variable. So you see these big error bars, but the largest component in these fuel beds is the litter, indicated in the teal. The tree biomass that's available for burning, which doesn't burn in these surface fires, is the next largest component, and typically indicated by the sort of the pink color. And then there's the duff, which tends to be the other large component. And some sites also have significant grass or shrub contributions, but those tend to be less. And on the table on the left, you can see the percentages overall of these materials. So litter, duff, downwind debris, that comprises the majority of the surface fuel bed, and most of that material comes from the trees. So again, these are coupled. So if we estimate canopy fuels with LiDAR, then we can indirectly get an estimate of the annual production of surface fuels. And then even less directly, if we model accumulation over time and then decomposition using climate data, we can get estimates of the ground fuels, which is the duff below the surface fuel bed. And then there's this underlying assumption that with time since fire, an asymptote will be reached, or an equilibrium, such that the litter accumulation is balanced with decomposition. And that's the Olson model approach from 1963. So it's quite an old model, but it works well, at least for this frequent fire context that we are doing this study in. It is, though, an oversimplification of ecosystem complexity in these processes. So on the left is a map of the estimated crown fuel biomass at the scale of the tree crowns. So the red color indicates higher crown fuel biomass. And then from that, we consider the deposition rate. So if it were deciduous trees, they would be dropping all their leaves every year. But conifers tend to drop every 2 or 3 years, their needles. And so we can estimate a rate of annual production and then deposition. And then we convert the polygon maps to raster maps, because that's what fire behavior models like QuickFire, they need those kind of inputs, actually voxelized inputs. So we make it into a raster in this depiction here, and then we apply a convolution filter. And this is the simplest way actually to simulate some dispersal, because not all the material falls directly beneath the tree. Wind and other factors cause that to spread around a little bit. So that's how we get the maps of surface fuel. And we can do this at scale. So on the left are 2 of the operational burn units that we burned in this project at Fort Stewart. Each one is several hundred acres. And the red box shows the zoom in, where you can see the individual tree crowns on the right. And so the areas of darker green have higher production. This particular map is actually the fine woody debris, but the patterns here would be similar for the litter production as well. And where there's an absence of tree crowns in the brown background, those are the tree gaps. And so we have less woody production in those local tree gaps. So on the left here, this graph is showing the fire return interval, and this is from a site called Osceola that I'll get to in just a minute. But this is where we had the best long-term data for accumulation rates. And at set fire return intervals of 1, 2, or 4 years, or unburned, the litter actually accumulates, but then asymptotes, just like the Olson model would predict. Whereas the duff continues to accumulate. And so that's the fate of litter when it decomposes. So this is based on data, and this kind of justifies the approach we're taking for modeling accumulation. On the right is a depiction of the spatial distribution of the litter. And you can see that most of the material accumulates near the tree bowl at 5 of the sites that were sampled by the 3D Fuels project. And then with distance from the bowl, you have less of that material. So overall, we have this coupled process. And the final point to make here is we're estimating not just crown biomass and the branches from the crown contributing to downwoody debris, and then the foliage contributing to the leaf litter. But if we're going to count for duff accumulation, we also have to consider the roots. And so the duff estimates are also spatially heterogeneous in the same coupled pattern as the litter and the downwoody debris by this modeling approach. So then we can get spatially explicit maps of all these materials for the benefit of managers. And just like we need allometric equations to get structural estimates of biomass, we need turnover rates to get temporal estimates of accumulation. And so something like foliage has a very high turnover rate relative to the branches, and the bowls themselves are the lowest turnover rates. And then considering the roots, most of the root material that goes into duff formation comes from the fine roots, and just a tiny fraction from the coarse roots. This is the Osceola National Forest long-term experiment, where each of these burn blocks has been maintained for over 60 years at these set fire return intervals of 1 year, 2 years, or 4 years, or unburned. So this is a randomized block design. But regardless of the fire return intervals, the tree biomass is very similar as we've mapped across these experimental burn blocks, and then what they contribute to litter and duff formation is also evenly distributed. But what accumulates over time is the duff. And what's comprising that duff? It's the fine roots is almost half of what contributes to duff formation. And then the litter, which is a combination of leaf litter from the foliage and then all the other material from the tree, is actually slightly more than the leaf litter. The downwoody debris coming from the branches is actually a minor component of the fuel production. So the model, if you run it from a steady state 60 years ago to present, we can model the accumulation of duff in those unburned blocks. And it's the 4-year fire return interval where we're modeling a steady state condition. And then at 2 and or especially 1 year fire return intervals, that's where you have overall decline in the amount of duff because it gets combusted by those more frequent fires. So finally, I just want to show a couple accuracy assessments. We do have field data from this range of sites. And so if we compare our model estimates of litter to what we measured on the ground, we get very little bias in that relationship. And this is actually published. And the duff accuracy assessment, which is based on this longer term data set at Osceola National Forest, This is in review, but we're very successful at showing from randomized sample points that the observed duff loads are matching what we predicted across this range of fire return intervals. So in conclusion, trees are the foundational objects that are constraining vegetation and fuel distributions at this tree object scale. The litter and the duff are the largest contributors to the surface fuel bed, and they come from the trees for the most part. So we're using LiDAR to get a tree biomass directly, and then indirectly, we can estimate surface fuel loads by accounting for these ecosystem processes in our approach. And this is of great benefit to the DoD because now we have a way to generate maps of these materials at scale. And we can do that and also incorporate their ancillary information, such as their fire history records. So we know how long it's been since the last burn, and we can calculate the fire return interval. So this is very relevant, I think, for these DoD installations of Fort Stewart and Eglin Air Force Base and Fort Jackson, where we've developed this approach, but we'd like to extend it to other installations, including those that are not so frequently burned. So some of the papers that I've cited here, I have this slide of available resources for more information, largely about the turnover rates. And just like to encourage you to contact me if you have any questions, because I'm eager to talk about this work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andy. For our audience, as a reminder, please submit your questions to Andy using the Q&A box that's on the Zoom screen. Andy, the first question is from EPA ORD. Have the surface fuel measurement percentages been evaluated across the U.S. in other regions other than the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast?
Well, we focused this study in the frequently burned systems because of better data availability. But now that we have a modeling approach built, we would like to try it in other systems. And we're not aware of as many data sets elsewhere, but we are on the lookout for those. And we, in the absence of other local data sets, we do have FIA estimates, but those are kind of designed for regional inference. And I have some ideas about how we can use that with relevance to the DoD installations. But if there's anyone out there listening to this who has knowledge of local data sets of surface fuels, I'd be very happy to learn about those.
Okay, sure, understood. And how well do you think this approach could work in forest ecosystems that are not so frequently burned?
I think it would work very well, actually, because the processes are the same. So we would just have longer periods of accumulation and, you know, not the same loss due to combustion. So, for example, Western ecosystems, we know that a lot of these have not burned for too long because of an absence of fire. But by this approach, we could actually look at the overstory and the time since fire and the lack of fire in the fire history from the satellite record and model accumulation over, well, 50 years potentially when you consider the length of the Landsat record from which we can get burn histories. So I'm really excited to try it in other systems.
Okay, great, thank you. And then where could folks find these models?
Well, the litter model is published and the duff model is in review. These are designed for remote sensing inputs, and because they're empirical, you need to train them with data. So while the approach works well for where we've parameterized it, it would need to be reparameterized for other DoD installations or other systems in general. So we would like to develop a tool where we could make it easier for the user to define those parameters and then use the model. But it would take
Okay.
some expert user knowledge to understand the parameters and to do that.
Gotcha. Understood. Next question is from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Are wildlife breeding seasons considered at all in this and in the fire burn intervals?
Well, we piggyback onto operational burns that the DoD managers do. So they're very aware of those issues. I always think of the red cockaded woodpecker in a lot of these longleaf pine forests on the installations. So they pay a lot of attention to that and other threatened and endangered species. So we let them make those decisions about when and where to burn. We just want to provide them better products like these maps and tools like we'd like to develop in the future, so they could do a better job of making those plans when and where they want to burn.
That makes sense. Thank you. Getting to that and controlled burns, is there any way to use the dust accumulation model to predict when the controlled burn should be initiated to mitigate wildfires?
Yeah, so this modeling approach is focused on the loads, or you could say fuel densities and kilograms per meter squared, megagrams per hectare, tons per acre. So that's essential information, but then it doesn't tell you about fuel moisture. And so you need you need to know what the fuel moisture is out there to really know how much might be consumed. And so that's an important input into fire behavior models. So a prescribed fire planner would look at the loads and they'd look at the current fuel moisture and decide whether it's safe to burn, or if it's getting to be too dry to burn, or if it's too wet to actually achieve anything by trying to burn. So part of the information that a fire manager needs to make a decision, but this doesn't provide all of it. It's just providing the loading.
Okay, understood. Thank you. And we've had a number of questions about Western ecosystems. So would looking at the surface fuel loads, like on the overstory, work just as well in the West, where there's, many more wildfires, and does the depth layer also exist in the Western US? How applicable is it to the West?
Yes, in the West, these same processes occur. The West tends to be drier. That means there's less decomposition for the same temperature, because you need that moisture to get the decomposition. So that causes litter accumulation, but eventually that will turn into dust. So it's just the rates that will change. And like those turnover rates that we're looking for, we need estimates like that for Western systems too, to properly parameterize the model.
Sure. Okay. And then we've also had a couple of questions about other potential tools. So how do you see the use of terrestrial LiDAR in data collection for sub-canopy fuels? And is there any other type of radar, like ground penetrating radar, that would work better as a remote sensing tool?
Right. On the ground penetrating radar, I've seen that work where you have very dry systems, because radar is very sensitive to water. But it's not a technology that could be done at scale. And I haven't seen evidence yet that it could give you reliable estimates of the depth like we would want for litter and say duff estimation. TLS is a much more promising technology, not for the litter and the duff either, but for the understory, like the shrubs and even the herbaceous component, or getting better estimates of the tree biomass especially in the bowls. A lot of biomass estimates are based on tree diameter measurements, but we can get those now from terrestrial LiDAR, which has a horizontal view perspective. So we can get accurate diameter measurements of the trees and then the shrub density too. Because an airborne LiDAR has to see through the overstory canopy, it's much less sensitive to that shrub and understory component than the TLS. So with TLS, but we don't get the landscape coverage with TLS, of course. But using both technologies, the TLS to get plots better characterized and the shrub density in a plot, we can then scale that up better with ALS. So in combination, I think TLS and ALS can work really well. Another thing that TLS can capture is sort of that ladder fuel idea, because surface fuels, if they go into the canopy, such as in Western ecosystems, they often follow that conduit of a ladder fuel, such as low tree branches. TLS is good at capturing that component, and it's important. So I think it might, I see evidence that's being incorporated more and more into sampling strategies where you don't just measure fuels by traditional methods in plots, but you add a TLS scan too.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And this next question is from the Department of National Defense in Canada. And it's about grassland biomass. Can LiDAR measurements efficiently describe variation in grassland biomass where there is not the tree cover? Or are you just looking at tree biomass?
Yeah, we're focused on forests because that's where LiDAR really stands apart, because you have the three-dimensionality of forests. Now, that doesn't mean grasslands are not also three-dimensional. They are. But LiDAR is a little bit of a hammer for the nail of a grassland ecosystem. A shortcoming of spectral data in forest is that the signal can saturate, and that's part of the problem with getting accurate biomass estimates in high density forest, high biomass forest from spectral data, whereas LiDAR doesn't asymptote in that way. But in grassland environments, there's no saturation issue, and the spectral data actually can provide good estimates of biomass. LiDAR can too, and I myself have modeled the surface fuel loads and grass fuel loads from LiDAR, but there's still quite a bit of uncertainty because those grasses aren't that much higher than the ground itself, and so it's a bit of a noisy signal because of just the nature of the LiDAR sensor and how long it takes to reset between the different return levels of a discrete return system.
Okay, great, understood. Thank you so much, Andy. Thanks for the presentation and for answering the questions. And to our audience, if you have more questions for Andy, just indicate that when you type in your question in the Q&A box, and we can ask them later. So now we'll move to our second presentation, and that will be given by Dr. Sarah Brambilla, who is a scientist at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. Sarah's work in wildland fire modeling has focused on fast-running microscale wind modeling in complex terrain, fire and atmosphere interaction, smoke transport and dispersion, and smoke impacts on road visibility. She is a developer for the quick fire and quick smoke models and has participated in field campaigns to gather data for model validation. Sarah received her bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in chemical engineering in Italy. Sarah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we'll start with the scope of this program, the ESTCP program related to the quick fire and quick smoke demonstration capabilities. I'll go a little bit into the prescribed fire planning workflow to see all the pieces that go into really modeling a prescribed fire. I will give you some of the model background, and I will show two of the main products of this program in relation to model validation at Fort Stewart and an example and application for road visibility. So the scope was to validate and demonstrate the LANL quick fire and quick smoke models at DoD sites. And the idea is that if we have a model, we can escalate prescribed fire application to the land and support all the kind of activity DoD wants to do to reduce wildfire risk, but also for conservation efforts. We have a set of tasks into this program to support this mission. Especially, we had to focus on improving some of the inputs, like importing weather forecasting, better winds. And then we had to validate the model for both flat and complex terrain and do some outreach. The idea is that this model doesn't just stay on our computers, but it's actually given into the hands of the practitioners so they can exercise it to do prescribed fire modeling. So prescribed fire, I heard this quote and I really like it, is the way to replace fire chance, your wildfires, with fire choice, because you really get to choose when, where, and how to burn. And that's in time and the location, because in an installation, you always have many burn plots that you could burn any day, but also how, and that's especially in relation to ignitions and weather. So the kind of inputs that go into the modeling of prescribed fire are the fuels, the ignition, and the weather. For the fuels, we really need to see the 3D the layout of the fuel. So the separation, for instance, between the surface fuel and the canopy, but also horizontally if there is any discontinuities. Prescribed fires are oftentimes low-intensity fires, so they're very sensitive to meter scale type variations in fuel loads and moistures. Also, in absence of a LiDAR fuel, the surface fire may not transition to a canopy fire, which could be a desired effect, depending on what kind of fire you're realizing. On the ignition side, prescribed fire are very different from wildfires. In wildfires, usually you have a point ignitions, the fire starts from a down power line or a lightning strike, and it moves out with the wind and topography. In prescribed fire, instead, the way you ignite determines what kind of fuel consumption you get and what kind of fire you get. So you can do things like lines of ignitions, you can do multiple lines, you can ignite through ATVs and drip torches, but you can also have aerial ignitions, for instance, especially in complex terrain, using things like helicopters or nowadays drones. So the kind of ignition pattern you choose is one thing that the fire manager can really decide upon. The other thing that goes into the modeling is the weather. And that means a lot of things. It means for sure the winds, but it also means the mixing height and things like the atmospheric moisture, which determines the fuel moisture for the dead fuel. And here we can have point measurements. Those are usually if you take them at the site before burning, or if you have like a spot forecast that someone is doing for you, or you can use a 3D forecast that includes how the weather is changing in time, but also vertically and horizontally. Of course, in some regions, this would be more relevant than others. Like if you're in complex terrain, there could be very many variability in wind speed and direction with horizontally and vertically, whereas in more flatter areas, they may matter less. However, for instance, if you're close to the coast, you could still get a lot of variabilities. Once you specify all those inputs, we can go into the modeling. And here at Los Alamos, we developed those two models called quick fire and quick smoke. And I'll go into the model in a later slide. But the idea is that you predict the fire behavior, you predict the smoke behavior, and what you get out of it are fire effects. For instance, the ecological objective, have you reached them or not? The wildfire reduction potential, so this will be your fuel consumption. But also you have smoke effects like population exposure, especially in case of PM 2.5 and visibility impairments. The thing is, if you're doing this modeling exercise, once you get to the end, you can check if you have achieved desired results. And if you haven't, you can go and manipulate the inputs. That could mean doing fuel treatments. It could mean burn on a different day because you have different weather. or use a different ignition pattern. And you can kind of play with those things until you get what you really want to. And especially what you don't want is a fire escape, the transition from a prescribed fire to a wildfire. On those boxes, I put some names of some agencies. It's not an omni-comprehensive list, but these are some of the partners we're working with to address all those things. And for instance, ND Works will go into the fuel part. And so we have to collaborate with a lot of people to get all the inputs and all the analysis we need to say if the prescribed fire can be done and if it's done successfully. So on the model background, those are just two quick slides. We have some papers out, but you can also reach out to me if you want more information. But the idea is that quick fire is really to simulate the fire in the burn plot, which is usually below 1 or 2 kilometers in size. We use meter scale fuel, voxelized fuels, winds, and topography. We capture the fire behavior both in the marginal conditions, so high moisture, low fuel loads, low winds, but also high intensity fires. We wanted to cover the full range. The other thing is we include the fire atmospheric feedback. So the fire generates heat, the heat generates updrafts, and that means the winds close to the fire gets changed by the presence of the fire, and that changes where the fire goes. We also want to capture the effect of multiple ignitions. Oftentimes, wildfire modeling don't capture this because that's not typical of wildfires. And so they cannot be used to represent prescribed fires. And we also want to compute the fire emissions and those induced winds. On the quick smoke side, once you've done the fire and you simulated how much heat and emission you have, we can pass over this data to quick smoke. And we use this nested grid approach where we simulate the burn plot at higher resolution, and then we simulate out up to 100 kilometers at lower resolution, with the idea being that there are less gradients as you move away from the burn plot. This is typically done in meteorology and air quality studies to have grids at different resolutions. And the idea is that we can capture really the high gradients at the burn plot and then but still go out without using meter scale resolution over those kind of distances. It was meant to be tied to quick fire, so it can import all the emissions and fire-induced winds. It transports both gases and particulate matter, particulate in general. So in this case, we have CO and PM 2.5 simulated. It includes particle deposition, so as you move longer distances, you can see the particles separating for the gases. What we do not have right now is particle condensation on particles, so the fact that a particle can grow and the formation for the particles due to atmospheric processes. So this is, I just want to show a validation against the first year 2022 burn. We use the fuels from fast fuels. We're looking into using something Andy has actually measured and shown in his slides too. But as you can see, there's spatial variability. This is fuel density. At the ground level, there's high spatial variability with areas with more and less fuels. On the ignition side, all those dots that you see in the plot, those are the ignition from the helicopter, and the blue are the torches. People came in and kind of stripped the sides to make sure to get the right fuel consumption and burn in. But we're accounting as they're put down. They don't all appear at the same time. They appear in the domain as they're put down on the land. Winds, we want to test two different ways of specifying the input winds. We use the high resolution rapid refresh reanalysis product. Those are hourly 3D winds at 3 kilometer resolution. You can see here the ground level slice for 1 timestamp, but it's a full 3D varying in space. But also we try with the MesoWest measurements. And in this case, the blue is the smoke area smoke modeling domain. This the square right there, it's about 30 kilometers big. And as you can see, there's only 1 station in there. We're using also all the other stations around it to interpolate the winds at the domain, but of course, they'll have less weight than the one in the domain itself. To MesoWest, to say is that it's just one, it's a measurement at 10-meter height. That's the only thing they provide. For validation, and this gets really into what do we compare to. So for this case, there were 2 satellite passes over there of interest, so we use those. Those are viewed from the top. So while we can compare if spatially the plume is at the right place, we cannot tell if it's the right height. in the atmosphere. The other thing is we had a point measurement, and it was just a 1 gram measurement. So going into it a little bit, this was from a multispectral, the Sentinel-2B. So one thing to say of the fast fuel. Fast fuel is a statistical representation on the land. So it includes, it will give you a statistically significant forest. So it has the right kind of fuel distribution, but every tree is wrong in that sense. So it will have the right kind of clumping and densities, but none of them is at the right place. Because to represent those kind of large areas, you can make for every plot a measurement with LiDAR. And so what you're doing is a machine learning type approach that fast fuel is providing. So when we compare the image to the left to the images to the right, we'll never expect point by point to be the same. It just cannot be. But the idea here is that we get kind of the same, is the fire burning the same amounts? Do we see kind of the same behavior at the same time? What do we see? We're in the process now to develop some more quantitative indexes to compare than just me say they look kind of the same, because that's not very scientific. And but just to give a measure, is the amount burned kind of the same or not? And again, this is just one measurement at one time, so we don't know at later time what that look like. We also didn't have the wetlands in this simulation. That's another thing we wanted to see, is how much does impact the fire spread. So this is still much work in progress, and we want to include those too to see how much they change fire behavior. On the smoke side, we had this one. It was 50 minutes after the beginning of the ignitions. And as you can see, the image cuts off, so we don't quite know where the smoke ends. We can only make assessments to what we see. And comparing it to the two ways of initializing wind data, what we see is that the HER data captures better the spread, but it seems to be a little bit too fast. Whereas the MesoWest seems to capture the temporal. If we assume the smoke ends where the image ends, it seems to be better at the timing, but it's less spread sideways. It's kind of hard again to say which one is really better here. And looking at longer distances, this was very interesting because smoke is coming down from basically the north, and then suddenly it takes off a 90-degree angle to the right. And speaking with people with knowledge of the area, we think this is some kind of breeze effect. Unfortunately, I could not see that in the wind data I had. And so, as you see in the plumes below, we don't quite capture the 90-degree turn. The HER model doesn't see it. The MesoWest seems to see better, but again, it seems to be a bit lagging a little bit behind. The other thing to say about this comparison is the white outline is just me drawing on the image above, and I'm drawing what I see. The thing is, I don't have a concentration threshold at which smoke kind of disappears from the RGB image at the top to kind of bound my plume. If I'm saying if there's some concentration there, I'm plotting it, but it could be that below a certain concentration, it should be taken away to compare to the RGB image. The other thing, there was a team from Georgia Tech that was doing ground measurements, and they were planning for westerly winds. So that location where they had the ground measurements, that would have been perfect. And then the wind shifted to northwesterly the day of the burn. And so they looked very much under the cloud, but they were not. That smoke is elevated off the ground, and so they didn't get any measurement. We didn't get any measurement either in quick smoke, but I wouldn't say that's a validation point. The other plot that they burned the day after, that one actually went over this measuring station at the ground. And so once we run that one, we will have something to compare to. So validating every aspect is really hard. I know there is some additional data out there. It just hasn't been processed in a way that's easy to compare to model. We see some decent agreement with the burn areas. Because the weather forecasts are imperfect, it's hard to compare the smoke transport over those long distances. And that's something we could think about for future campaigns, to have also wind measurements, not just at the burn plot, but also tens of kilometers downwind to populate the inputs of the smoke model. So once we can see smoke, what do we do with it? One of the things we focused on was road visibility. And this is the same burn plot, but the winds are not the winds of the day. Those are prescribed by me just to push the smoke toward the highway, which is the red line you see on this map. The idea was to investigate if, depending on wind speed in this case, if can we create hazardous condition on the highway and cause excess accident, basically, because we're reducing the visibility. The way we're doing it is oftentimes when you see like on Blue Sky and those other smoke products, those smoke modeling tools, they will give you one image of the smoke, maximum concentration, maybe that kind of things. We're trying to get also the timing, because if it takes the smoke an hour to get there, that can help you decide when to start burning and maybe not putting smoke on the road during commute hours. So the top plot is showing the road network from OpenStreetMap. The way we compute the braking distance to say how much visibility you need, it's from both the speed limit and the reaction time that comes from Department of Transportation tables. And so based on that, we prescribe a minimum visibility and compare the braking distance and say if it's safe or unsafe. The other thing we're trying to get at, again, is this temporal aspect. Of course, everybody can say if you have to close the road for 30 seconds, that's probably not an issue. You just don't close it. Whereas if you have hazardous condition for 15 minutes or longer, you can start thinking about different action, which could be burning under different wind conditions, or posting, for instance, temporary speed limits, like when there are roadworks. So we're trying to provide this data and see, right now talking to end user, what could be useful. So we need this validation exercise to really understand the model error and its uncertainty, if we really have to use it as a way to plan prescribed fires. We need more data. More data is coming in future experiments. We have one coming up in Mary Island. I thought it was March. It's actually April 2025. We'll get more smoke data. While we have developed this model from first principle on visibility, we have no data to compare to. Fog is a different beast. Doesn't have this spatial gradient in concentration that smoke has. So we're going to, it was for Liberty when I brought the slide, it's for Bragg again now, but we're going to for Bragg to try to put some smoke on their roads and do some measurements there and get some data point for validation. And on the outreach side, again, with the idea of giving out the model, having people use it, we've done several workshops and meetings to showcase our tool. And usually our tools are wrapped into a graphical user interface where you don't have to know a lot of things that happen behind the scenes. Benefit, we hope to be providing a tool that can support prescribed fire escalation on DoD lands. And we really want to provide something with understood uncertainty and limitations. The other thing is that since the forecasts are imperfect, we are trying to push, especially with the University of California, San Diego, the concept of ensemble simulations, so that you can vary the input parameters in a way that makes sense around the forecast, but that you can reassess the day of the burn if it's a go or no go condition. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to write me with them.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sarah. And as a reminder to the audience, please submit questions for Sarah using the Q&A box on your screen. So Sarah, the first question is, what additional data could help with model validation the most? What about using remote sensing, and what about using drones?
I think drones are very promising. Unfortunately, especially for smoke concentration, while we've been doing ground measurements for 50 years at least, drones are a new beast. And so I think we need to come together as a community to discuss what's the protocol to do those measurements, because there are things like residence time or drone-induced turbulence. And so prescribing, should we move the drone from far out in? Should we move it up and down? Should it capture just the highest concentration in the middle of the plume or also the boundaries? There are a lot of questions that I think we should address to get the most out of it, because drones are a cheap way nowadays to get 3D data. So it's very exciting.
Okay. What about complex terrain? Can the model handle fire and smoke when there's really complex topographic changes?
So yes, we do have parts there. They address topography, influence on both fire spread and smoke. That's the second part of the validation exercise, is actually to push it into the complex terrain and see what breaks and what works well. And we haven't just gotten there yet. I know we've done things with, for instance, Yosemite to help them plan their burns. So there are initial efforts, but a full flag validation effort hasn't been done as of just yet.
Okay, sounds good. And what about the software? Is it open source? Can it be obtained somehow? Is there a graphical user interface or an online service?
So the software, Leno has its own licensing agreement, so you'll have to contact us and we'll have to establish a licensing agreement. It's not open source because of the way Los Alamos operates. But it can be obtained, and as I was saying, especially for government, it's easy to distribute to government entities, like we already distribute to the Forest Service, EPA, so that, or USGS. That's easy to do. Is we've done also university. We have people in Canada now using it, so it can be done. It comes with a graphical user interface, again, to try helping you setting up the problem, and we're always working to improve it and put a new feature that can help the user. And we also have, UCSD has a beta version of a online interface to do ensembles. I don't know who will have access to this one. I think the idea was to have fire manager have access to this one. But I think that's also very valuable because, again, with just a couple of clicks, you can specify the inputs, automatically extract inputs from services like fast fuels, and populate your domain and have this more and more of an idea what could happen if the condition vary.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Can the model predict ember wash or fire brands?
So oftentimes in the fires we have trying to address are the low intensity fire with not much ember wash by design, because you don't want the fire to jump the road and burn what you didn't intend to burn. So we do have an initial capability that usually it's turned off for prescribed fires. I wouldn't go and say that's a well-established capability. We do have, again, it's an initial thing that would require a lot of validation.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Sarah. At this time, Andy, we would like you to come back on the line, please. We have a couple more questions for you, and then we'll start to wrap up after that. So, Andy, could you please talk about whether FIA plot data would be useful in your framework, the forest inventory and analysis data?
Yes, I do think it would be useful. The advantage of FIA data is it's nationally available and it's a design-based sample. So that means we can make inferences at the national scale based on those estimates and consider them unbiased. And that same assumption can work over a larger a regional domain where you have sufficient FIA plots. Even large DoD installations wouldn't have that many FIA plots, but I think by expanding consideration of the same forest types, even outside of the DoD lands, we can get estimates from FIA that are relevant for the DoD installations. We'd also have to look at the fire histories inside and outside the installations to see how well they're covering those distributions, those ranges of variability. Now, a disadvantage of FIA data, having looked at it some, is it's very noisy. So even though it may be unbiased, it's not precise. So I think the approach we're doing has great potential to provide spatially precise estimates. And then I would like to take those and say, if you aggregate those to the scale, to a coarser scale, such as a large DoD installation, then you could compare them to FIA and see if your estimates are biased. Because we need we need a way to control for the sampling bias of our kind of opportunistic data sets that we are obtaining from other investigators or from other research projects on DoD fires and that sort of thing.
Okay, Andy, that makes sense. Thank you. Next, what about land fire estimates? Are those estimates something that could be correlated with your model?
Yes, we haven't looked at that for Fort Stewart or Eglin, where we've been focused on the objects project. But we could and we should, and we've done that in the West, actually, where we take sort of a bottom-up approach like I'm presenting here and comparing to FIA and, or sorry, not FIA, land fire. You asked about land fire. And the land fire maps are, they're nationally available too, and they provide fuel bed estimates. The most detail can be found in the FCCS maps, the Fuels Characteristic Classification System, which has a big diversity of different fuel bed types. So I think those are useful, and they're often used for larger scale emission studies to predict how much emissions might come from burning. But in a study we did in the West, we found them to be, the loadings to be twice as high as what we could estimate from local field data and LiDAR. That was just based on 2 fires though. So we need to do more of those kinds of comparisons. So it is a resource, but it is pretty prone to some misclassifications too of the forest type. But when I've looked at them, the majority of FCCS fuel bed calls are accurate. So I think they're good to use at a larger scale of aggregation and then maybe filter out some of the misclassifications. But then you still have to be cautious of the loadings. They could be biased overall.
Okay, sounds good. So some more work to do. Okay, so now I'd like to start to wrap up the webinar and ask each of our speakers to please summarize the next steps in their projects or in the work that they talked about today. So Sarah, we'll start with you. And can you also talk a little bit about your timeline for model validation as part of that?
So we plan on some of the model validation throughout the next year or so, but this is very much a continuing research effort here at Los Alamos. So it will continue even further, and also some other aspects are addressed at other different projects. Like we have field campaigns for other programs for wind modeling assessments, and that would improve the wind solver we have in the model. And so there's a lot going on under a lot of different projects. 12 months for the ESTCP, I would say, and longer but we will continue even after.
Okay, understood. Thank you so much, Sarah. And then Andy, could you please summarize the next steps that you'll be taking?
Right, thanks for the question. So this is the last year of funding for the Objects Project, and we want to finalize these maps, several of which I showed you today, and provide those to our DoD host, our partners. And then I'm working on a follow-up project proposing to the ESTCP program to develop a tool to make this modeling approach that I presented more accessible and available to managers at installations, because right now it's just basically an in-house tool. And there was an early question where I made reference to this too. And then I'd also like to be able to scale it up. So I've been focused on several operational burns, and it's working well at that scale, but we want to scale it up to provide estimates across entire DoD installations, and then pull in other sources of information too, like FIA, like in my response to the question just a couple of minutes ago. So there's that. And the other aspect that I didn't really get into today is consumption, and using LiDAR-derived estimates of fuels before and after the burn. We can actually, that's an approach to get, by differencing those estimates, we can get a map of consumption. So we'd like to dig more into that and also relate those to active fire measurements of the fire rated of power. Because if you integrate those over time, you can get an energy flux estimate, which also gives you the ability to predict consumption. And in theory, those two independent methods to estimate consumption should give you the same answer. And that's been demonstrated in small experimental fires, but I'm really motivated to do that at the scale of large operational burns. And so that is something we're doing in the Objects project, and we have some good results based on ground radiometer data that demonstrate the similarity in estimates of consumption between measuring heat flux and then measuring the difference between pre and post fire fuel loads.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much, Andy. At this time, we'd like to thank both Andy and Sarah for the presentations today that were really interesting and very relevant, and answering all of the questions. To our audience, we would like to remind you that you can visit the SERDP and ESTCP webpage at the link shown here, and to see and register for upcoming webinars as well. I would also like to remind you both the audio and a copy of the slides from today's session will be on the webinar webpage in case you want to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it if you could please take a moment and complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. Thank you, everyone. This concludes today's webinar.